Hello there. Today's video is on Requirements Traceability Matrix. The first time you hear about the Requirements Traceability Matrix, you might not know about it, but it's a very simple concept used in software development and testing. Once you understand it and have seen the example in this video, you will find that Requirements Traceability Matrix is a simple concept and you can use it effectively in your project. What is Requirements Traceability Matrix? As the name indicates, it's a matrix. That means it's a table. It's a table that shows many-to-many relationships between the requirements and the test cases. So in your project, you are going to have multiple requirements, and in the project, you are going to have multiple test cases. So the Requirements Traceability Matrix is the table that shows you the relationship between the requirements and the test cases, meaning that which requirement is implemented by which test cases, one or more test cases, and which test case tests which requirement. It can be one or more requirements. Now sometimes Requirements Traceability Matrix can be a big matrix, so it can be divided into a number of tables. So there can be a mapping of business requirements to software requirements. So at the high level, the business requirements are there, and then you have the detailed software requirements. So there can be a one-to-many relationship. One business requirement may be broken down into several software requirements, and also the detailed software requirement, a single requirement, may implement one or more business requirements. Then it can have another table showing the relationship between the software requirements and system architecture, between the system architecture and design specifications and test cases, and automated test scripts. In every case, it shows a many-to-many relationship. Now there is also the concept of forward traceability and backward traceability. Forward traceability means that we are moving from earlier in the software development lifecycle to later in the software development lifecycle. For example, we can say business requirements are there first, and then they are translated into detailed software requirements. So that is an example of a forward traceability. Then we can go backwards also. We can see from software requirements, we can move back to the business requirements. So we can see the relationship both in the forward direction as well as in the backward direction. Now the most common requirement traceability matrix is what shows the relationship between requirements and test cases, and that is what we are going to see in the example. So let us look at the example now. Now here is the example of the requirement traceability matrix, and here you can see that it's a table, and on the x-axis, that means horizontally, we have the requirements listed out over here. So each requirement is listed in one column in the table. So we have requirement 1, 2, 3 and so on. And then we have the test cases. Now test cases are on the y-axis or given vertically. So we can see we have test case 1, test case 2, test case 3, like that. So how this table shows the connection between requirements and test cases? Well, let us see requirement 1. And when we are looking at the column of requirement 1, we find that there is a mark placed against TC1. So this indicates that requirement 1 is tested by TC1. That means requirement 1 is tested by test case 1. And you can have different IDs for the requirement here. Just for example, I have given requirement 1, requirement 2, etc. But you can have something else as given in your software requirement specification or user stories. It may be 1.1 or 1.0.1. Anything can be there as a requirement ID. Basically, each and every requirement will have a different and unique requirement ID. And same is true for the test cases also. Each test case in this example has a different ID. We have TC1, TC2, etc. And in your project it can be different. It can be TC100, TC200 or anything like that. So back to the relationship. So here we can see requirement 1 is tested by TC1. Now let us take another example. Let us see the example of requirement 2. Now requirement 2 is tested by two test cases. There is a mark for both TC1 and TC2 and TC3. So that means requirement 2 is related to TC2 and TC3. It is even more test cases in the case of requirement 3. So we can see that it is TC1, TC13, TC14 and TC15. So like that, a relationship is indicated between each requirement and each test case. Now it is a many-to-many relationship. What this means is that one requirement may not be covered completely by a single test case. It may take more than one test case to test that requirement. But at least every requirement will have at least one test case that is going to test it. Now here there are the totals. So how many test cases test out this requirement? So we can see in the case of requirement 1, it needs one test case. In case of requirement 2, it needs two test cases. In case of requirement 3, it needs 4 test cases, and so on. So this number will always be 1 or more than 1, because there should be at least one test case to test out that requirement. Now this is understanding it from the requirements point of view. We can also look at it from the test cases point of view. So from TC1, we can see that TC1 tests out requirement 1 and requirement 3 and also requirement 10. So TC1 tests out parts or fully requirement 1, requirement 3 and requirement 10. Now we can go to TC2. TC2 just tests out requirement 2. TC3 just tests out requirement 2. TC4 tests out requirement 4 and requirement 5. TC5 tests out requirement 4 and requirement 5, like that. And here in this column, after the TC ID, we have the total, meaning that this test case tests how many different requirements. So we can see TC1 has a total of 3. It tests out 3 requirements: requirement 1, requirement 3 and requirement 10. The total is 1 in case of TC2. It just tests out requirement 2. TC3 also total is 1. It tests out requirement 2. And it is 2 in the case of TC4. Why? Because it tests out requirement 4 and requirement 5. So this is about the requirements traceability matrix example that shows the many-to-many relationship between requirements and test cases. Now we have to keep some useful points about the requirement traceability or RTM in mind. First of all, it should not contain any text from the requirements or test cases. Why? Because requirement traceability matrix is just a summary of the relationship between the requirements and the test cases. So it should just have the IDs like requirement 1, requirement 2, etc. It should not have any text. It should not say, for example, requirement 1 user authentication. No, that text belongs to the requirements document, whatever requirements document you have. Another point to keep in mind is that the RTM should be created as early as possible in the project, because otherwise what happens is if you leave it out until late, then you're going to have a lot of requirements and a lot of test cases. So you have to go through each and every requirement and each and every test case to figure out the relationship. So it should be created as early as possible in the project. The next point is that every time any requirement changes, now you have to look at the RTM to see which test cases cover that requirement. So whenever the requirement changes, you look at those test cases again to see if the relationship is still holds good or not. If not, then you maybe have to add more test cases or change the relationship so that your requirement traceability matrix is always accurate. Same thing when you are updating the test cases. So let us say you enhance a particular existing test case, and now instead of covering a couple of requirements, it now covers 3 requirements. Then you have to go back and update the requirement traceability matrix. The next point is that sometimes there are workflow changes due to the changes in requirements, and these can be complex because they can involve a number of requirements changing. So that is where you have to be really careful, because a number of requirements change and you have to look at all those requirements and look at all the test cases that are impacted so that you can accurately update your RTM. Now the RTM document is an important document because number one, it summarizes the relationship between the requirements and the test cases, and also it is a very useful document for review purpose. So before the testing starts, you may want to review that each and every requirement has at least one or more test cases that test out that requirement, and actually look at the test case to see whether it fully tests the requirement or not. So this requirement traceability is a very important document. That is why it should be kept in the version control software or revision control system. And also the requirement traceability matrix is used by multiple people. So when it is kept in the version control system, so that time changes to it can be controlled and you will not lose any data in the RTM. These days, many teams use project management software or test management software. Your project management software or test management software may have the feature of automatically generating the RTM. So if that is the case, then you should definitely use it. So that is all there is to the requirement traceability matrix, or the RTM, or some people call it the traceability matrix also. It is an important document because it shows you the relationship between the requirements and the test cases, which test cases test out which requirements. It is very useful to share among the team because the team exactly knows, after looking at the RTM, which test cases test out which requirements and whether each and every requirement is covered in the test cases or not. And it is also a very useful document to review the test cases. So once the test cases are complete, you can use the RTM, and looking at the RTM, you will understand which test case covers which requirement and whether or not each and every requirement is covered. So that can help you a lot when you see that whether the requirements are fully covered in the test cases or not, and whether the test case accurately covers the requirement. So that is all for this video, and see you in the next video. Thank you.